On the night of December 11, 1944, something occurred in the waters off the Philippines that had never happened before in recorded military history and would never happen again. 5 Japanese warships were destroyed in 18 minutes by weapons that were never designed to fight at sea, fired by men who had never trained for naval combat, from a shoreline that should have been impossible to defend. 750 enemy soldiers died. Not a single American was lost. What you are about to hear is not legend. It is not exaggeration. It is the single most improbable engagement of the Second World War, and almost no one knows it happened. The men called themselves the Old Bastards. It was not an insult. It was a badge of survival. The 77th Infantry Division of the United States Army had earned its reputation through blood across the Pacific, and by December of 1944, those who remained were no longer the young recruits who had shipped out months before. They were hardened, methodical, and deeply aware that the war in the Philippines was not going as planned. Leyte Island was supposed to have been secured weeks earlier. Instead, it had become a grinding, vicious campaign of attrition in which every ridge, every village, and every yard of jungle had to be taken at cost. The Japanese were not retreating. They were reinforcing, and they were doing it by sea. Ormoc Bay lay on the western coast of Leyte, a deep natural harbor that had become the primary artery through which Japanese forces poured reinforcements onto the island. American intelligence knew that troopships and barges were making runs under cover of darkness, landing soldiers and supplies to sustain the Japanese defense. Air superiority belonged to the Americans during daylight, but at night, the sea belonged to whoever dared to move across it. The Japanese dared often. Their convoys would approach the bay in darkness, unload rapidly, and withdraw before dawn. It was a rhythm of resupply that threatened to turn Leyte into a prolonged nightmare for American forces. Breaking that rhythm was essential. But how do you stop ships when you have no navy in position, no coastal artillery, and no time? The answer came not from doctrine, but from desperation. The 77th Infantry Division had pushed to the edge of Ormoc Bay and established positions along the shoreline. Among their assets were M10 tank destroyers, tracked armored vehicles designed for one purpose and one purpose only, destroying enemy tanks. The M10 was built around a 3-inch gun mounted in an open-top turret, capable of firing armor-piercing rounds at high velocity across relatively flat terrain. It was never intended to engage naval targets. It had no firing tables for ships, no training protocols, no specialized ammunition for maritime combat. The crews who operated them had been trained to fight German panzers in Europe and Japanese armor in the Pacific. They had never been told to aim at something floating. But on the night of December 11th, that is exactly what they were ordered to do. Intelligence reported that a Japanese convoy was inbound. Transport 159, a medium-sized troopship, was leading a column of barges and smaller vessels toward the beach. The convoy carried reinforcements desperately needed by Japanese forces further inland. If they landed, hundreds of fresh soldiers would enter the battle. If they were allowed to withdraw, they would try again the next night. The division commander made a decision that existed nowhere in any manual. He positioned the M10 tank destroyers along the ridge overlooking the bay, sighted them toward the water, and waited. Corporal James McKenzie was the gunner in one of those M10s. He was 23 years old, from a town in Ohio, so small it did not appear on most maps. He had joined the Army in 1942, trained at Fort Hood, and deployed to the Pacific in early 1944. By December, he had seen combat on multiple islands. He knew how to traverse a turret, estimate range, and fire on the move. He had destroyed Japanese bunkers and engaged light tanks. He had never fired at a ship. None of them had. The crew sat in silence as the sun went down over Ormoc Bay, the water turning from blue to black, and waited for something they could not quite believe they were being asked to do. The night was moonless. Visibility over the water was nearly zero. The sound of the ocean against the shore was constant, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. The crews kept their voices low. Orders had been clear. No lights, no movement, no firing until the command was given. They did not know when the convoy would appear or even if it would come at all. Intelligence was rarely perfect. The Japanese could have changed course. They could have delayed. The entire night could pass in silence. But at approximately 2200 hours, a lookout reported movement, dark shapes on the water, no lights, no engine noise audible yet over the surf, just shadows sliding slowly across the black surface of the bay, moving toward the shore. The M10 crews were alerted. Turrets began to traverse slowly, quietly, tracking the movement. Range estimation at night over water was nearly impossible. The gunners had no instruments for it. No laser range finders, no radar, just eyesight and experience and the vague shapes of vessels that might be 1,000 yards away or 2,000. The standard engagement range for an M10 against armor was under 1,000 yards. Beyond that, accuracy dropped steeply. But they had no choice. The ships were out there, they were closing, and if they reached the beach, the mission would fail. Then the flares went up. Illumination rounds fired from mortars, bursting high above the bay and drifting slowly downward on parachutes. The light was pale, ghostly, unsteady, casting the entire scene in a flickering white glow that turned the water silver and the ships into sharp black silhouettes. Suddenly, there was no ambiguity. Transport 159 was clearly visible, a dark mass moving at slow speed approximately 1,500 yards offshore. Behind it, the barges, smaller, lower, moving in formation, all of them outlined perfectly against the illuminated water. The order came through, fire. The first shot came from McKenzie's gun. He had traversed the turret as far as it would go, elevated the barrel to compensate for distance, and aimed at the largest shadow on the water. The 3-inch gun fired with a crack that shattered the silence of the night, the muzzle flash lighting up the entire ridge for an instant. The armor-piercing round screamed across the water at over 2,000 feet per second. McKenzie did not know if it would hit. He did not know if it would even reach the target. Armor-piercing shells were designed to penetrate steel plate at close range, not to fly across open water at extended distance. The ballistics were wrong. The situation was wrong. Everything about it was improvised. But the round struck. The impact was visible even at that distance, a bright flash low on the hull of Transport 159, followed by a secondary glow that spread rapidly. The ship did not explode. It did not break apart, but something critical had been hit. Fire began to spread along the waterline. The vessel began to slow, to list slightly, to lose its heading. The convoy hesitated. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the other M10s opened fire. The sound was overwhelming. Multiple 3-inch guns firing in sequence, reloading, firing again. The night sky lit up with muzzle flashes, tracers arced across the water. The air filled with the smell of cordite and burned propellant. The Japanese ships tried to respond, but they had nothing that could reach the ridge. Their weapons were meant for close defense, for repelling borders or strafing landing zones. They could not elevate enough. They could not see their attackers. All they could do was attempt to withdraw. But it was already too late. Transport 159 was burning heavily now. The crew attempted to beach the ship, to run it aground and save the troops aboard. The M10 crews adjusted fire, tracking the movement. Round after round slammed into the hull. Some punched clean through. Others detonated on impact. The armor-piercing shells, designed to defeat thick steel plate, found thinner maritime hulls almost no resistance. Each hit compromised the integrity of the vessel further. Water poured in through rents in the hull. Fire spread through the interior. Within minutes, the ship was listing heavily to port. its engines silent, its deck crowded with men trying to abandon ship into water that was dark and cold and filling rapidly with burning oil. The barges tried to scatter. They broke formation and turned back toward open water, attempting to flee the kill zone. The M10 gunners switched targets. The barges were smaller, faster, harder to hit, but the illumination flares kept coming, lighting the bay in relentless pulses of white light. The gunners walked their fire across the water, adjusting for movement, for distance, for the slight roll of the vessels. One barge took a direct hit to the engine compartment and exploded in a fireball that briefly shone the flares. Another was holed below the waterline and sank within seconds. A third tried to make a run parallel to the shore and was bracketed by fire from 2 M10s simultaneously, the rounds converging on it from different angles until it simply disintegrated. The entire engagement lasted 18 minutes, 18 minutes from the first shot to the last. When it was over, 5 Japanese vessels were destroyed. Transport 159 had capsized and sunk in shallow water, its hull visible above the surface like the spine of a dying animal. The barges were gone, scattered across the bottom of the bay or burning on the surface. The estimated casualty count among Japanese forces was 750 men. Some drowned, some burned. Some were killed by the concussive force of the shells themselves. The exact number would never be known. What was known, and verified the next morning when reconnaissance patrols moved along the shore, was that the convoy had been annihilated. Not a single American soldier was wounded. Not one M10 was damaged. The crews sat in their vehicles as the last of the flares burned out, the bay returning to darkness, the only sound now the crackle of distant flames and the low murmur of the ocean. They had just done something that no one in the history of mechanized warfare had ever done. They had sunk warships from the shore using tank destroyers, and they were still trying to understand what had just happened. The Japanese attempted to run convoys into Ormoc Bay on subsequent nights. Each time the M10s were waiting. Each time the result was the same: ships destroyed, reinforcements lost. The rhythm of resupply was broken. Within days, Japanese command abandoned the attempt entirely. Ormoc Bay was no longer viable as a landing zone. The troops already on Leyte would have to survive with what they had. No more convoys, no more night runs. The sea route was closed. American command was stunned. Reports filtered up through the chain of command describing an engagement that seemed impossible. Tank destroyers engaging ships at night, at extended range, with complete success. Senior officers demanded confirmation. Investigators were sent to the site. They interviewed the crews. They examined the wrecks. They reviewed the after-action reports. Everything checked out. The sinkings were real. The method was real. The results were undeniable. The United States Army had just won a naval engagement without using a single naval asset. The implications were significant enough that the Ordnance Department took notice. The M10 tank destroyer had been designed with a specific role in mind. It was meant to be mobile, to maneuver on the battlefield, to engage enemy armor at favorable angles and then withdraw. It was not meant to serve as coastal artillery. It was not meant to engage targets at sea. But it had done so, and it had done so with devastating effectiveness. The question became whether this was repeatable, whether it could be formalized into doctrine, whether other units could be trained to do the same. The answer ultimately was no. The circumstances that had made Ormoc Bay possible were too specific, too dependent on terrain and timing, and the particular vulnerabilities of the Japanese vessels involved. The M10s had been positioned on high ground overlooking a narrow bay with limited maneuver space for the enemy. The Japanese ships had been lightly armored transports, not warships built to withstand heavy fire. The illumination had been perfect. The range had been just barely achievable. The crews had been experienced and disciplined. All of it had come together in a way that could not be reliably reproduced. Doctrine requires predictability. This had been anything but predictable. Still, the tactical manual for the M10 tank destroyer was quietly updated. A single paragraph was added, noting that under specific conditions, the weapon system could be employed against maritime targets. No training protocols were developed. No specialized ammunition was issued. It was an acknowledgement, nothing more. A footnote in a manual that would be obsolete within 2 years as the M10 itself was phased out in favor of more modern designs. But the footnote remained. A small recognition that on one night, in one place, the impossible had occurred. The veterans of the 77th Infantry Division did not speak much about Ormoc Bay after the war. It was not because the engagement lacked significance. It was because the entire Philippine campaign had been brutal and exhausting, and filled with moments that defied easy explanation. Ormoc Bay was one night among many. The men who had been there remembered it, but they remembered it as part of a larger whole, not as an isolated event to be celebrated. War does not pause to admire its own strangeness. It moves forward. The division continued to fight across Leyte, then Okinawa, and then prepared for the invasion of Japan that never came. By the time they returned home, Ormoc Bay was just another entry in the division's long and complicated history. Corporal James McKenzie returned to Ohio in 1946. He worked in a factory. He married. He raised children. He rarely talked about the war. When asked, he would mention the islands, the heat, the difficulty of the terrain. He did not mention the night he sank a ship with a tank destroyer. It was not modesty. It was simply that the event did not fit easily into conversation. How do you explain something like that to someone who was not there? How do you describe the absurdity of aiming a ground weapon at a naval target and watching it work? It was easier to say nothing. The official history of the 77th Infantry Division includes Ormoc Bay. It is described in factual terms, with emphasis on the tactical success and the disruption of Japanese logistics. It is not dramatized. It is not presented as the defining moment of the campaign. It is simply one action among many, recorded for accuracy and completeness. Historians who study the Pacific War occasionally note the engagement as a curiosity, an example of improvisation under pressure. But it does not feature prominently in most accounts of the war. There are no monuments dedicated to it. No films have been made about it. It exists in the margins of history, known to specialists and forgotten by almost everyone else. And yet the facts remain indisputable. On the night of December 11, 1944, armored fighting vehicles designed for land combat engaged and destroyed enemy warships from a static coastal position. It was the only confirmed instance of such an engagement in the entire Second World War. It has not been repeated in any conflict since. The specific combination of circumstances, desperation, and capability has never aligned in the same way again. The technology has changed. The tactics have evolved. The war itself is long over, but the event stands alone in the historical record, singular and irreproducible. There is something profoundly strange about an event so decisive being so obscure. Ormoc Bay changed the outcome of the campaign for Leyte. It severed a critical supply line. It forced Japanese command to abandon an entire operational approach. It saved American lives by preventing reinforcements from reaching the battlefield. By any measure, it was strategically significant, and yet it is remembered, if at all, as a footnote. Perhaps it is because the engagement does not fit neatly into established categories. It was not a tank battle. It was not a naval battle. It was something in between, something hybrid and uncomfortable to classify. Military history prefers clean lines. Ormoc Bay was anything but clean. Or perhaps it is because the event, for all its success, could never be doctrine. Doctrine is built on repeatability. It is built on the principle that what works once can be made to work again, that success can be systematized and taught. Ormoc Bay could not be systematized. It was the product of terrain and timing and desperation, and the particular capabilities of men who were willing to try something that made no sense on paper. You cannot train for that. You cannot plan for it. You can only recognize it when it happens and be grateful that it worked. The M10 tank destroyer itself is long gone from active service. The last examples were retired in the 1950s. A few survive in museums, preserved as relics of a war fought with different tools and different thinking. None of them, as far as anyone knows, bear any markings or plaques indicating that vehicles of this type once sank enemy ships. There is no reason they would. The engagement was so specific, so isolated, that it does not define the weapon. The M10 is remembered for what it was designed to do, not for what it did on one impossible night. The waters of Ormoc Bay are quiet now. The wrecks of Transport 159 and the barges have long since been salvaged or claimed by the sea. The ridge where the M10s were positioned is overgrown, unremarkable, indistinguishable from the rest of the coastline. There is no memorial, no marker, no indication that anything extraordinary ever occurred there. The bay itself is simply part of the Philippine landscape, used for fishing and transport and the ordinary business of life. The war passed through and left scars, but those scars have faded. Only the records remain. And the records tell a story that seems almost fictional in its improbability. They describe a night when the rules of warfare bent in a way they were never supposed to bend. When weapons designed for one purpose were forced into another and succeeded beyond all reasonable expectation. When men who had no business fighting ships destroyed an entire convoy and walked away without loss. It is the kind of story that, if it appeared in a novel, would be dismissed as too convenient, too implausible. But it is not fiction, it is history. And history, unlike fiction, does not need to be plausible, it only needs to be true. The truth is that war creates situations that no amount of planning can anticipate. It forces improvisation. It rewards adaptability. It punishes rigidity. The men of the 77th Infantry Division understood this instinctively. They were not military theorists. They were not innovators in the academic sense. They were soldiers tasked with an impossible problem and given inadequate tools to solve it. They solved it anyway. They took what they had, positioned it where it needed to be, and fired until the problem was gone. It was brutal. It was efficient. It was utterly without precedent. And it worked. There is a lesson in that, though it is not a comfortable one. The lesson is that capability is often a matter of imagination as much as equipment. The M10 could sink ships because someone was willing to ask whether it could, and because the crews were willing to try. The technical specifications said it was not designed for that role. The training manual said it was not meant for that mission. But the situation demanded it, and so it happened. Doctrine followed reality, not the other way around. That reversal, that willingness to let circumstances dictate action rather than allowing doctrine to constrain possibility, is rare. It is also dangerous. Improvisation can fail as easily as it can succeed. Ormoc Bay succeeded, but it could just as easily have failed, and if it had, the story would be remembered very differently if it were remembered at all. But it did not fail. The ship sank. The convoy was destroyed. The supply line was cut. The campaign for Leyte continued and eventually ended in American victory. The war moved forward. The M10 crews reloaded their guns, moved to new positions, and prepared for the next engagement. They did not dwell on what they had done. There was no time for that. There was only the next mission, the next island, the next impossibility that would have to be confronted and overcome. War does not pause for reflection. It demands forward motion until it is over. When it finally was over, When the surrender was signed and the divisions began to come home, the men of the 77th Infantry Division carried with them the knowledge of what they had accomplished. Ormoc Bay was part of that knowledge, but it was only part. They had fought across the Pacific. They had taken ground that was supposed to be untakeable. They had lost friends and survived horrors and done things that would mark them for the rest of their lives. Sinking ships with tank destroyers was just one entry in a long catalog of experiences that defied easy summary. It mattered, but it mattered as part of a larger whole, not as a singular defining moment. That perhaps is why the story has faded. It was significant to those who lived it, but it was not the only significant thing. It was extraordinary, but the entire war was filled with extraordinary moments, most of which have been equally forgotten. History is selective. It remembers what fits into narrative arcs, what can be easily told and retold. Ormoc Bay does not fit easily. It is too strange, too specific, too resistant to generalization. And so it has slipped through the cracks, preserved in official records and specialist histories, but absent from the popular memory of the war. Yet the absence of memory does not erase the event. It happened. 5 ships were destroyed. 750 men died. An American division held a coastline against a naval resupply effort using weapons that were never meant for the task. The impossible occurred, was documented, was confirmed, and then was quietly filed away. The war continued. The men came home. The weapons were retired. The manuals were updated and then discarded. The bay returned to peace. And the world moved on, largely unaware that on one night in December 1944, the rules of war had been briefly suspended, and something unprecedented had taken place. If there is a final thought to carry away from this, it is that war is not only what we plan for, it is also what we are forced to improvise. The men at Ormoc Bay did not choose their mission. They did not design their weapons for it. They did not have the luxury of preparation or ideal conditions. They had only necessity and capability and the willingness to attempt something that had never been done. They succeeded not because success was guaranteed, but because failure was unacceptable. That is not heroism in the cinematic sense. It is something quieter and more durable. It is professionalism under pressure. It is adaptability in the face of the unknown. It is the willingness to do what must be done, even when what must be done makes no sense. The night of December 11th, 1944, was one of thousands of nights in the Second World War. Most of those nights are forgotten. Most of the men who lived through them are gone. Most of the battles they fought have faded into statistical summaries and dry historical accounts. Ormoc Bay is no different in that regard, but it is different in one respect. It was the only night in the entire war when armored fighting vehicles engaged and destroyed enemy warships from shore. It was the first time it happened. It was the last time it happened. It will almost certainly never happen again. The convergence of circumstances that made it possible is gone, dissolved into history along with everything else from that era. And yet knowing that it happened once is enough. It is enough to understand that the boundaries of what is possible are wider than we think. It is enough to recognize that the men who fought that war were capable of things that defy expectation. It is enough to preserve the story, even if it is not widely known, because stories like this deserve to be remembered. Not because they are inspirational in a shallow sense, but because they are true, because they happened. Because real men, with real weapons in a real place, did something that should have been impossible and made it work. That is the story of Ormoc Bay. That is the story of the old bastards and the night they sank 5 Japanese ships with tank destroyers. It is a story without embellishment, without fiction, without exaggeration. It is simply what happened, and what happened was extraordinary. If this story moved you, or if you learned something you did not know before, consider subscribing to this channel and leaving a like on this video. Share it with someone who appreciates military history, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Knowing what you now know about Ormoc Bay, do you think such an engagement could ever happen again in modern warfare, or was this truly a singular moment that can never be repeated? Your perspective matters. History is not only about remembering the past. It is about understanding what the past can teach us about the present and the future. Thank you for listening.